So let me begin with a story going back to 1977. I'm going to talk about a man called Nicky Gumbel that you may have heard of. He was dating his girlfriend, going out to dinner on that particular evening. He was very nervous because he was planning to propose to her. And so he had a particular strategy, which was to ask a couple of questions. So he asked her first of all, would you ever like to get married? Yes, she said without hesitation. And Nicky was encouraged by that answer. So he went on to his second question, which is, whom would you most like to marry? Prince Charles, she said, again, quick as a flash. Well, he was a little bit put off by that reply, and he went a little bit quiet, and he got a bit nervous. He wasn't quite sure how to proceed. But eventually he plucked up the courage and he asked her another question. Pippa, would you marry me? Yes, she said, again, quick as a flash, and Nicky was thrilled. So that obviously was an important choice that she had to make that evening, but we make choices all the time. Every day we make choices. A lot of the time they're trivial. For instance, for me, recording this message, do I wear a cap or don't I? Well, let's put it on and see what it looks like. You know what, I think I'll stick with the hat. So we make choices all the time, but sometimes in life there are really big ones that come along, and this Bible reading will reflect that. Let's listen to these verses from Matthew chapter 7.
Matthew 7, verse 13. The narrow and wide gates. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Verse 24. The wise and foolish builders. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law.
Okay, thank you. So, I want to ask a question arising from that reading, and the question is this. Which gate will you enter? Which gate will you enter? Because Jesus gives an illustration. He talks about gates, and first of all he says, wide is a gate and broad is a road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. So I'm standing here by a gate, by a wide gate, and Jesus talked about a gate and said that's one option, that's one choice, to choose that particular gate, go through it, travel on the road. It's a broad road. Unfortunately, it leads to destruction. We can call that road Easy Street. We can call it Easy Street. And many people go down this particular road. They go down this road, and on this particular street, you can be proud, you can be angry, you can be unforgiving, you can live for yourself, you can keep all your money if you want to. And people who make this choice, very often they think they've got freedom to live life as they choose. But the problem with that kind of freedom is that it leads to all kinds of abuse if we're not careful. Maybe someone thinks they've got the freedom to drive as they want to drive dangerously. Unfortunately, if they drive like that, they end up having an accident. So that was one gate that Jesus talked about, but it's not the only gate in his illustration, because he goes on to talk about another gate, and I've moved over from a wide gate to a small gate here. And Jesus said, small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So this is a different gate, a different road beyond, and fewer people choose to go through this gate than the broad gate. And the reason for that is because the road beyond the gate is a hard road. It's a difficult road, and people who go down this road, what they need to do is to live humbly and honestly, to do to others what they want them to do in return. But let me tell you, if you choose this road, the road that Jesus talked about beyond the small gate, the narrow road, I guarantee you that life will not be boring. It's a narrow road of adventure, and I promise you God will take you out of your comfort zone. So we have a choice. Jesus said we have a choice. 2 gates, a broad gate, a small gate. Very, very vital decision. We all make that choice to go through one gate or the other and either travel down the broad road or the narrow road. Second question that Jesus asked in the passage, basically he was saying, where will you build your house? Where will you build your house? He talks about a foolish man. He talks about a wise man. He says that the foolish man makes the choice to build his house on sand. And unfortunately for him, when the rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So people that make that kind of choice, who, as it were, build their houses on sand, and they're okay until the weather changes and the rain comes down, etc., etc. What is the rain that Jesus is alluding to there in this illustration? Perhaps it's to do with the problems in life, the difficulties, the disappointments. People that make that kind of choice to live independently of God would struggle much more with the downs of life, and eventually they will face God's judgment. That's one choice. The other choice Jesus talks about, the choice made by the wise man to build his house on the rock. I'm standing on rocks here today. There are rocks all around me, and Jesus said that the wise man built his house on the rock. And again, in this scenario, the rain came down, and I can tell you at this very moment that it's raining, so that's very timely. So this man, he made the decision to build his house on the rock, and the rain came down, the streams rose, the winds beat against that house, and yet it didn't fall. Why didn't it fall? Because it had its foundations on the rock. And Jesus was saying that wise people, it's like they're building their house on a rock. They put in their trust in God. Generally in life, they're more robust, they're more resilient, they're more persevering. 2 choices with 2 very different outcomes once again. So, I'm going to ask one more question before I close this message today. A different kind of question, which is about salvation. The message that Jesus gave was basically all about salvation in terms of which gate you go through and whether you build your house on the sand or whether you build your house on the rock. It's all about ultimately whether you decide to follow Jesus and receive the salvation that he offers, or whether you decide to live independently of him and please yourself. When we think about salvation, there's a phrase that very often we use, which is this, that we are saved by grace, by God's grace. And yet what I've said so far, you could easily conclude that the way that we receive salvation is by doing good things rather than bad things. From what I've said so far, you could easily conclude that if you're honest and humble, if you're trusting God, if you're robust, if you're persevering, then if you do all those things, you'll get to heaven. And on the other hand, you could conclude that if you're proud, if you're angry, if you're unforgiving, if you're selfish, if you're money mad, that you will end up going to hell. Well, let me try to bring some clarity here, that there is a paradox in the Christian life. The paradox is this, that you can't be saved by good works, but there is a sense in which you can't be saved without good works. Ultimately, salvation is by God's grace. It's by what he has done supremely through Jesus dying on the cross for us. It's all of him, it's not of us. But good works are important. Why are good works important? Because good works give evidence that something really has taken place, that we have really received our salvation from God. So, you're saved by going through the small gate. Saved by going through the small gate, but the Christian life is like a journey on the narrow road beyond. Who is this message for today? Who is this message for? Is this message for you? Well, if you're not a Christian at this time, the message is for you. If you're unsure whether you're a Christian, the message is for you. And I'm going to ask you one final question as I conclude today. If you died tonight, are you 100% sure that you will be with Jesus? Think about that question. Think about your answer. If the answer is no, my suggestion to you, why not listen to this message a second time and ask God to speak to you? Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.